then going to the government and asking the government to bring about policies to control things, policies which tend to leave us worse off than if the government had never intervened. If you worry about us running out of oil, as people did in the 1970s, you go to the government and you say, we've got to do something. We've got to tell the automobile companies to make cars that will, on average, use less gasoline. So the automobile companies change the kinds of cars they make. They go into an emergency pattern. The cars they make are not much better in the short run. Open those companies up to competition, which is more than ordinary competition, is disastrous for those companies. The government and the airlines decide they've got to worry about $3 a gallon gasoline by the 1990s. So the airplane manufacturers and the airlines spend billions of dollars to redesign airplanes for this supposed $3 a gallon gasoline, twisting themselves all out of shape, when if the government had not forecast $3 a gallon gasoline, and if the government hadn't gone to the automobile companies or hadn't gone to Congress and said, let's make laws to control these things, we would have been a lot better off, would have saved us endless economic aggravation. We would have done better if the sequence hadn't occurred, if people had not become frightened of impending shortages based on their lack of appreciation of what's happened in the past, and if they hadn't therefore gone to the government and said, intervene, do something about this. So it's not just a matter of our feeling better about it. This appreciation also has positive economic benefits for us.
Well, I don't think it's too far from the mark to say that you've challenged a number of accepted theories. We've already touched on some of them. Using what I assume is the same data, how do you reach what are essentially contrary opinions?
We all use the same data, Bob, but some of us use more of the data than other people do. If you look at what has happened to, you looked at, say, iron prices from the year 1940 to the year 1975. You look at those iron prices and say, my goodness, the prices of iron have been going up. We ought to do something about it. And some people will use 35 years of iron prices or 15 years of iron prices or 2 years of iron prices. I want to use those data plus the iron prices that go back to the year 1800 for the United States, or the iron prices that go back to the year 2000 BC or 3000 BC. And when we use so much data, we see a different story. We see that what has happened since 1940 with iron is a mere blip in history. Or we look at what had happened to wheat prices starting in 1973. Sure, you get into a panic if you look at just 5 years or 10 years prices. But if you look at the prices of wheat since the year 1800, you see a different story. You see a long-term decline coming way, way, way down, and some blips here and there. But if you only look at the blips, then you see a very different story. Yes, we're all looking at the same data, but some people look at only a small squib of those data, and often a squib that shows what they would like to see. Whereas if you look at all the data for a very long period of time, you can't simply pick and choose in that fashion.
What you're touching on here, it seems to me, is a way of thinking. The way of thinking of the engineer, the way of thinking of an artist, the way of thinking of, an economic forecaster. What are the differences? Is it just a matter of looking long-term?
Let me broaden my answer to your question, Bob. So much of our problems, and I'll use the word problems for a change, in dealing with resources and population and the environment stem from bad thinking. And there's several kinds of bad thinking that go in here. One of these kinds of bad thinking is looking only at what happens in the short run and what happens immediately, rather than looking at what happens in the longer run and looking at the indirect effects of things. For example, when a baby comes newborn on this earth, that baby is nothing but a burden. You're a father, you know that very well, that children are a burden. All parents know that. And that's all there is in the short run. Dirty diapers and a lot of noise, hassle on the street. But if you look at the longer run, if you look after the first 20 years of the child's life, you look to the next 20 years or 40 years or 60 years, you see a reversal, and you see something very different happening than in the short run. You see the child beginning to make a contribution which is greater on balance than the burden that the child constitutes in the short run. So that's one important kind of bad thinking, the bad thinking of focusing only on the short run and only on what's obvious and commonsensical and easily seen. Another kind of bad thinking, which you were referring to when you mentioned engineers, is using thinking which is perfectly appropriate for one kind of situation and applying it to another kind of situation. It's awfully obvious that if we didn't do some planning for this TV session today, if you hadn't gotten the crew together and gotten the place and gotten the funding and gotten the distributor to distribute these tapes, this would not have happened. It took rational planning. It took business planning on your part. And creating this camera took rational engineering, design, and planning. That's great in the small. But if you try to use the same kinds of mental apparatus, the same kind of rational planning for an economy as a whole and for society as a whole, you go completely off the rails. Because rational design and controlled planning on the part of an individual or of a bureau or of an organization is wholly incapable of dealing with the problems of a modern, complex society. That's one of the things that we have learned. It's a very subtle lesson. It's a lesson that David Hume and Adam Smith taught us 200 years ago. It's a lesson that Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman have taught us again in our time, that when we have this large, complicated thing called an economy, it only works when individuals are left free to pursue their own projects, to plan for themselves, to seek opportunity, and to coordinate their plans, their lives, their needs, what they have to buy and what they have to sell, on a voluntary basis with everyone else. So every person, every family, every firm, pursuing their own plans separately, voluntarily, somehow in this incredible miracle, using what Adam Smith called the hidden hand, coordinates itself in a way that no central planning can possibly do. Now, this wasn't obvious to people. It wasn't obvious to the socialists that this wouldn't work. It wasn't obvious to the agricultural planners in socialist countries as well as in our country sometimes. They've thought that if we just got enough smart people together and enough computers together and enough clear thinking together, that we could run an agriculture and other industries more efficiently than could all these uncoordinated individuals doing their own thing. And in country after country, place after place, people have tried to rationalize agriculture. And it is a disaster. It's been a disaster in the Soviet Union. It's a disaster in Africa. It was a disaster in communist China until 1979. And the Chinese in 1979 suddenly got the word that it wasn't going to work. And in this extraordinary social experiment, the Chinese in 3 short years, between 1979 and 1982, effectively turned over agriculture to 700 million people. That's the largest private sector anything in the world. And this all happened in 3 short years. And in 3 short years, Chinese agriculture turned itself around completely, so that now you go to China, you can't move 10 feet without somebody wanting to sell you some chow. It's a great delight. Chinese agriculture is now overflowing because they have freed up people to do their own things voluntarily. The engineering planning, the business planning, the rational planning, it just doesn't work.
But are you saying in a sense that having the right knowledge is only one part of the formula?